you, Barb. Welcome everyone to this fourth and final webinar of the ExChange Wales Conference Series on Dementia Support in a Diverse World. I'm Victoria Shepherd. I'm a Principal Research Fellow from Cardiff University from the Centre for Trials Research, and I'm also a member of CARE, the Centre for Adult Social Care Research. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing today's session on keeping well before, during and after a dementia diagnosis with Down syndrome. And we've got two really great presentations for you today from two great speakers, and that will be followed by time for questions, and we would love to hear from you. So please do put any questions you have into the Q&A box as we go through the presentations, and we'll pick up on those and that'll lead to some great discussions, I'm sure, after the presentations. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, Julian Hallett and Sofia Vougioukalou. So Julian is a Services Development Manager at the Down Syndrome Association. Having previously worked in community development for MenCap in the Rhondda Valleys, he joined the Down Syndrome Association 25 years ago and now leads the charity's work on health inequalities with a particular interest in ageing and dementia. Sofia is a Research Fellow in the Centre for Adult Social Care Research, CARE, and is the lead for the thematic group on dementia. She has worked on different projects that have explored unmet needs and inclusion preferences of underrepresented groups affected by dementia across different pathways in health and social care. So we'll hear from them both, and I think it's Julian first. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you. Thanks, Victoria, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you. As Victoria said, I'm the Services Development Manager at the Down Syndrome Association, and we're the lead charity supporting individuals who have Down syndrome and their families across the UK. So my particular area, I'm a psychologist by background, and my particular area of interest is around health inequalities and a particular focus on the experience of adults who have Down syndrome who are ageing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the onset of what we would consider to be early onset dementia. Adults who have Down syndrome are a particular population of individuals within the wider learning disability community who have a greater chance of developing dementia in later life, hence the particular focus on this area of work. So a couple of key questions really for us to consider, and I do this as a sort of 90-minute webinar, so this is clearly just headlines, but I'm going to touch on the particular issues around, is the ageing process for people who have Down syndrome different to the general population? Obviously, we are all ageing. We are an ageing society. We have a much higher proportion of older adults now living in the UK, and that's posing significant challenges when we look at the stresses that adult social care are experiencing across the UK. That is partly to do with the fact that we are dealing with a much older population. And then, are there specific health risks for people who have Down syndrome in later life? So in addition to the general experience that all of us may undergo in terms of ageing, are there particular considerations to think of for individuals who have Down syndrome? And then what are the implications for those of us providing support? So it's quite a startling statistic here, and this is a very positive story. If we think about typical life expectancy for people who have Down syndrome, there was a very influential study carried out about 14 years ago now. We're hoping that that will be updated for the current population. But a study in 2011 showed that the median life expectancy for adults who have Down syndrome, and obviously these are people who are nearing their end of life now. So if we think about individuals with Down syndrome who are much younger, their life expectancy may actually be different. There's been a vast improvement. So if you look at 100 or so years ago, the majority of people with Down syndrome didn't live into double figures. You know, their life expectancy was very much shortened. But now, so we still see life expectancy about 20 to 25 years younger than the general population. Typical life expectancy now in the UK is 80 plus. But we've had probably more than a doubling in life expectancy in individuals who have Down syndrome within a generation. So services are now catering for a much aging population of people who have Down syndrome. Partly that's to do with our greater understanding of the health profile associated with having Down syndrome. People are probably aware that around about half of people with Down syndrome are born with a significant congenital heart condition, and that in the main might require surgical intervention, and that's generally very successful in a way now that it wouldn't have been maybe 50 or 60 years ago. Thankfully, people who have Down syndrome or other learning disabilities don't typically live in what we would think of as hospitals. I started my career in resettlement in South Wales, working at the Grange Hospital in Gwent. We had Ely Hospital in Cardiff. We had Hensall in Mid Glamorgan. We had Bryn y Neuadd up in North Wales. There is obviously, people should be aware of the transforming care agenda. So we still have small numbers of people with a learning disability in inappropriate hospital type or treatment and assessment unit care. So although the general picture is very much improved, we do make sure that we're not complacent about people being inappropriately placed in, not in community provision. And we have a much greater understanding of the health conditions. And so we have things like annual health checks that all adults, well, all individuals over the age of 16 in Wales, 14 in England, are entitled to an annual health check with their GP, which would look for treatable health conditions, which would then reduce the likelihood of somebody experiencing either an avoidable or a premature death. And I love this picture, sent to us by a supported living setting actually in Cambridgeshire a couple of years ago now. And we were then inundated by other settings, including one in Pembrokeshire, who were able to document that they were supporting an individual who had Down syndrome who was 80. They had, close involvement with family and evidence to corroborate the fact that she was celebrating her 80th birthday. So lots of good news in terms of aging for people with Down syndrome, but also issues of concern. So this data particularly relates to to England, but I will make reference to the sort of Wales picture. Going back to 2007, Mencap wrote a very troubling report called Death by Indifference, which looked at about 100 case studies of individuals with a learning disability who had died from an avoidable cause. And as a result of that, in 2010, the UK government established what was a confidential inquiry and looked at the circumstances around those case studies and established what's called the LEADER programme. So the LEADER programme is called Learning from Life and Death Studies, and it looks at mortality of people with a learning disability in England. There is scoping work happening in Wales, and there is an intention to have a Wales-based mortality review, but the Wales data doesn't currently feed into the LEADER data that's collated in England. And that's the sort of headline data which says that individuals with a learning disability, if you are female, it's 22 years younger. Sorry, if you are male, you're likely to die 22 years sooner than in individuals without a learning disability. And if you are female, it's 27 years younger than the general population. And the likelihood of dying from an avoidable cause is more than double that of the general population. So in 2021, the contract to review the LEADER reviews are carried out at an integrated care board level. They are then collated nationally in England, and it's King's College London that produces an annual review. The latest annual review, which will be data relating to 2023, is due to be published imminently. And in the last year, they also added individuals with autism. So some people with a learning disability may also have a dual diagnosis of autism. many people with autism won't have a learning disability, and their data is also being included from the latest annual report going forward. So what we know, if we look at the deaths of individuals with Down syndrome, the prevalence of dementia is much higher than we would see in the general population. So about 10% of people with Down syndrome have a confirmed diagnosis of dementia if they are in their 40s, and that more than trebles for individuals with Down syndrome in their 50s. And that's significantly higher than the general population, and the age of onset is probably 30 to 40 years younger than we would typically expect. And then for individuals with Down syndrome who have died over the age of 35, around about 70% of those people will have had a diagnosis of dementia before they died. So good to pause now to show you a little film clip of some siblings talking about their experience of their brother who had Down syndrome aging. And so to give you a sort of window of lived experience of a particular family.
We're here to talk about our brother. My name's Kate Mardell.
And I'm Lucy.
Our brother John sadly passed away this year from dementia. He had Down syndrome. He was 51.
He was 51, yeah.
John lived in a residential care home for the last 30 years, well, for 30 years.
From the age of 18.
Yeah, from the age of 18, so he didn't live at home with our parents. And we're going to talk about probably the last 10 years, sort of with looking at the diagnosis and when things started changing.
The care home where he was living first sort of noticed that he was having problems with his memory in about 2010.
Yeah.
We think.
Yeah. And there's various correspondence between psychologists and GP and stuff, and we think the diagnosis probably around 2013. Informal.
Yes, it's mentioned by a social worker that he had early stages of dementia.
Stages. It comes up in his medical notes around 2015, 16.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of in the middle, really, of from noticing it to him passing.
Yeah, and we started noticing things that he just stopped being able to do, really, didn't we? That he wasn't
really gradually.
Yeah, that he wasn't clearing the table, and we just assumed that it was because he was being cheeky or lazy. And then he started getting little mannerisms, like flicking paper.
Yeah, toilet paper. But they're things that started very small.
Yeah.
And then escalated and escalated. Yeah. And suddenly the next thing you realise, he's got big pocketfuls of toilet roll, and there's no toilet roll in the toilet, and he's really possessive about it, and he's rummaging through the bins.
That's right, he was going
because
through the bins,
someone's taken it off him, and he's obsessing about the toilet roll. So, but you don't notice that because it starts so small and it creeps and creeps and creeps.
Yeah,
it's very hard.
I mean, just a tiny little window into the experience of one family, but very typical of, we run a helpline, we take about 10,000 calls a year, and around about 20% of those are from families that are dealing with an issue related to ageing. Very often this is the time in families' lives when primary caring roles often transfer from parents to siblings. So it was John's sisters who took a lead role in sort of coordinating his care, because parents would have been very much older. And actually, in their particular example, I know that they were dealing with their father developing dementia the same time as their brother. Very typical of individuals of his age who moved away from the family home into supported living when they transitioned into adulthood. So he hadn't lived at home from being a sort of young adult. And that sort of emerging diagnosis, so an informal mention of possibility of a dementia diagnosis in 2010. It then noted formally in his medical records from about 2015, and then him dying actually in 2020. So he'd actually lived with dementia probably for about 10 years, but had only probably had a formal diagnosis for about half of that time. And sometimes we see both service providers, professionals, family carers having to become sort of detectives and putting together a jigsaw. So tiny little subtle changes in an individual's behaviour can sometimes go under the radar, particularly for people with a learning disability, where there's that risk of sort of diagnostic overshadowing, where you see an individual having difficulties with cognition, which could be associated with them having a learning disability, but actually this is the beginning of something new. It's the loss of skill. It's a beginning of a decline in cognitive and functional ability that is related to the dementia diagnosis. So good practice, and there's lots of examples of this happening in Wales. For example, I know when Iron Bev and the Health Board have done a lot of work in relation to monitoring protocols and baseline assessments. So the British Psychological Society, this is a good practice guidance rather than a nice guidance. So it's not something that has to be done, but it's recommended. Recommend that adult social services or local health boards set up a register of their adults who have Down syndrome. So first of all, do you know where your population of people with Down syndrome are? And you should carry out a baseline assessment of cognitive function by the time the individual reaches the age of 30. So this isn't a dementia assessment, it is just an assessment of cognitive and adaptive function. And then you would have that on record. So if there was a concern raised, you could then go back and refer to that baseline to see if there had been a decline. And then best practice would be for individuals with Down syndrome in their 40s, you repeat that assessment biannually. And then for individuals with Down syndrome over the age of 50, you would do it annually. Because they are a population who are at greatest risk of developing dementia. The assessment is a sort of paper-based interview with a caregiver. It's not invasive. It doesn't involve taking blood samples or lumbar punctures or anything like that. And individuals actually, particularly if they're doing this on a regular basis, they sort of become quite attuned to doing the assessment, and so it's non-invasive and usually quite enjoyable for the person. And there's good evidence of that happening in various locations around the UK. You would need to carry out a differentiated dementia assessment. So the standard NHS dementia assessment, which GPs can carry out or other health professionals too, is called a mini mental state test. It's not accessible for somebody with a learning disability, but there are adapted dementia assessments. So there's a CAMDEX, there's the D-SQUID, there's the DLD. There's about half a dozen or so that are appropriate for a population of people with a learning disability. So just to quickly tell you a little bit about the support that the Down Syndrome Association can provide. We are an information and training and research organisation. So we're here to provide support to anybody with an interest, and that includes professionals. So any professional is welcome to call our helpline for information or advice. We have a lot of information on our website, and I've given the link there. There's a tab that goes across for health and well-being, and then there's a drop-down menu that is on aging and dementia. And two of our particular booklets, which are public-facing, they're meant to be for family carers or for services that are supporting people with Down syndrome who may be aging. There's a booklet called Getting Older, and that covers all of the issues relating to aging, not just dementia. We do quite often see we would call for a differential diagnosis. So if you see a change in an individual with Down syndrome as they get older, it could be the onset of dementia, but it could be related to a thyroid disorder. It could be related to depression or stress. It could be a sensory impairment. Actually, the person is getting forgetful or confused because their hearing is failing, and it isn't that they're becoming forgetful, it's more that they have a difficulty in hearing or seeing what people are telling them. Then we have a specific booklet on Alzheimer's disease. We have a closed Facebook group for family carers to join and provide informal support to each other. And I deliver regularly a sort of 90-minute webinar on aging and dementia, and that's available as a free to view pre-recorded session. So you can go onto our website, click training, click pre-recorded webinar and you can access that for free. Or if you want a live bespoke session, then you can email us and we're very happy to do that for any sort of staff team. Brand new, and this is hot off the press a couple of weeks ago, was an interactive, this is a 200-page resource. It's available as a printed hard copy called our workbook for families and staff, and it plots everything from pre-dementia all the way through to end of life. So it talks about keeping well, not that you can prevent dementia, but there are things that you can do to, you know, keep your brain health and your physical health, you know, as best placed to try and keep yourself fit and well. It's also available as a download, so you can either have a physical copy which you would fill in and write in, or you can have a digital copy which you would fill in online and save. And this has been written by Dr Karen Dodd, who's one of the lead. She was a psychologist working in Surrey, has recently retired, was the chair of the special interest group at British Psychological Society on learning disability and ageing. And so if anybody wants a copy of that, do find your way to it on our website. And I think my final slide before I hand over or hand back to Victoria and then an introduction to Sophia is every year we have an annual awareness week, and we have World Down Syndrome Day, which is always on the 21st of March because it's the 21st of the third month, and Down syndrome is the third copy, 3 copies of chromosome 21. And every year we produce a short promotional film. And I'm just going to show you this year's film, which was launched about a fortnight ago. Sorry, just before we go, so these are examples of some of the pages from the dementia workbook. So it's very practical. It relates to one individual, so you would get a dementia workbook for an individual that you were working with, and there would be sections to fill in at early, mid, late stage of dementia, and it's personalized to that particular person. So I think these pages and the following page relate to sleep disturbances in relation to dementia. People get very disorientated about time of day and may need some adaptations or prompting to try and help them manage their day and have a best quality of life as possible. And I'm sure Sophia's going to pick up on some of these themes. So short little film now to just lead up to the next part of this webinar.
I want to be when the decisions are made.
What should Sophia wear for your brother's wedding?
I think this dress could be really nice.
Or maybe this one a little less formal.
It pairs well with her beautiful smile.
I want to be when the decision is made. Where this decision is made. I want to have a say in the dress that I wear. Don't shoot if it's fair. Let me have a look at these clothes. You want to shoot, I don't like any of those.
The objective of this meeting is to approve this new proposal for an elegant and functional train station.
I want to be where this decision is made. Where this decision is made. If I'm here, I can help you recall that what's right for some isn't always right for all.
Here's the new place for all supplies. You might not realize that for me it's too high.
When you hear this, you got to dash.
Our info points now have touch screens.
It's great for those who are able to see.
During my term, we'll write new laws.
We'll impact us all.
So give us a seat too.
We want to be where the decisions are made. Where the decisions are made. Signs for us to be represented. Where the decisions are made.
This is what I'll wear.
So quite a catchy little thing. They're meant to, so there are about a dozen of these now because they've been launched once for every year, and you can go on to the World Down Syndrome. If you just Google World Down Syndrome film, you will find the ones from previous years. Each year they have a different theme. This was about informed decision making, you know, nothing about me without me. And I think the idea that you have to make adaptations and reasonable adjustments according to people's individual needs. Sofia and I thought that might feed quite well into the session that she's now going to lead. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think we now probably, I don't know if we're going directly into Sofia's section. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
I first came across Julian and the Down Syndrome Association. I think it must have been around 5 years ago, when I was part of a project on dementia and diversity, and we were looking at unmet needs for different underrepresented groups affected by dementia. And one of the topics that we talked about was the over and under diagnosis of dementia among the people with Down syndrome. What was interesting since progressing that work and now collaborating with Dr. Roser Benito Montague on a project on dementia and assistive technologies, which includes all our former collaborators, was that there's a real paucity of research on the experiences of people affected by dementia and Down syndrome in the last decade. There is quite a lot of biomedical research looking for what happens in the brain and medication. So when we start looking at how to best meet the social care needs for people affected by dementia and Down syndrome, I was very pleased that the handbook that Julian just mentioned came out this year, which focuses on quality outcome measures for individuals with dementia, and particularly how that can be implemented. And a core part of the book and its recommendations is that we focus on the 3 stages of dementia and how they present. And we've used that also in our analysis of when we talk to people who are affected and have lived experiences. So the first stage was the early signs, particularly looking for loss of everyday skills and executive function, loss of independence, personal hygiene, neglect, continence, and motor difficulties. And those who work in the field of dementia care will identify those for most people affected by dementia in the early stages, and how difficult it is to discern them, because they can also be signs of someone living with anxiety or someone living with depression as well. Then we've got the middle stage, where people require more support to help them with their day-to-day living. They might need frequent reminders to help to eat, wash, dress, or use the toilet. They might become more forgetful. They might also experience loss of long-term memories, resulting in them failing to recognize people or confuse them with others. And people at this stage might become upset, angry, or aggressive. And finally, in the late stage dementia, that's when the person with dementia will need even more help and will gradually become totally independent, so totally dependent on others. And that causes a lot of challenges when we talk about independent living and how do we help people stay in their homes for longer. Particularly so when loss of memory may become even more pronounced, the person might be unable to recognize familiar objects. They might become increasingly frail, and that may start to shuffle or walk unsteadily. The preference has been for people to be supported living at home and informal caregiving from family members. Some might experience burnout and depression. And some recent studies have looked at occupational therapy programs and how they can be addressed to reach individualized goals. Some methodologies that have been used in care homes, such as personalized life storybooks or rummage boxes with familiar items, have been tested to be used for people with Down syndrome and dementia at home, and they were associated with higher levels of well-being. So these are techniques that can be exported from reminiscence stories. More recently, there has been some research also on married couples where one of them is affected by dementia. And this study in 2010 was the first and only study of married couples where one person has a learning disability. There were different ways to approach care and support in relationships among partners, staff, and other family members. And the support could act as a facilitator as well as a barrier to people in their relationships. And this is particularly to what the video that Julian showed, which was that people with Down syndrome and dementia want to exercise their agency and independence. And sometimes when additional health conditions are coming, people's and family member support might be perceived as quite restrictive to one's independence and agency. And it's quite important for that to be maintained. So against this backdrop, we developed a new project on dementia and assistive technologies. It's funded by the Wales Innovation Network, and we look specifically at smart devices, communication devices, reminiscence technologies, and environmental adaptations. We include many different underrepresented groups, quite similar to the previous project on dementia and diversity, and people with Down syndrome is one of them. We focus on technologies because a lot of these support systems and a lot of telecare is now mainstream, and it's in people's homes, and it's a direction that social care professionals have found helpful, and also relatives as well. With the support from the Down Syndrome Association, we did a focus group with carers. And in that focus group, it was quite pronounced the love and commitment that parents and siblings have for their family members who have Down syndrome and dementia, and the stress and the tension that some have reported on allowing their loved ones to maintain independence, but also make sure that they're safe and prevented from harm, particularly as the condition progresses. The preference was for home or supported living. Hospital and assessment centers stays have been found to be problematic, not only for this group, but people with learning disabilities more generally, and particularly as the dementia progresses, symptoms of sensory loss and poor mental health have also been reported. I just wanted to finish with a couple of technologies that people mentioned that they found really useful. The first one is the Canary Care, which is a remote monitoring through sensors. In our workshops, we always ask people if they would find it too intrusive for loved ones to be able to see what they do. Some people are okay with it, others are not so sure. The Canary Care allows discrete monitoring of movement and temperature, but without any image or sound. And that can be followed from someone's phone. Similarly, My Home Helper is an online memory aid and a clock, and it can be maintained by family members online, and it does not require any input from the person living with dementia. So thank you very much for listening. Like I mentioned, this work is under development. We're developing research bids on dementia care and assistive technologies for underrepresented groups. This includes people with Down syndrome, as well as people who are experience vision loss or hearing loss, people who are deaf-blind, as well as culturally and linguistically diverse group, and the LGBTQ+ community. We would be very interested to hear from you, especially if you're a social care professional. And I would just like to acknowledge our funders and our partners for supporting our work. And thank you very much. And we're very happy to take your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you, Julian, as well, for two really great presentations. I think that really captured the kind of breadth of issues that we might need to consider and a kind of broad range of opportunities for support, for resources, perhaps for training and for future research as well. So really great to hear some of those. So yes, please do put any questions you have in the Q&A and we'll pick those up. And maybe if I start us off. So we've heard a lot of, issues and perhaps challenges, but also lots of opportunities and lots of potential ways that we might think about how we support people to be included in perhaps practice development, perhaps research, to ensure that that's accessible for people. And I wonder perhaps if you could pick up on some of the kind of summarise the kind of key things that we might need to think about if we're thinking about including someone with Down syndrome and dementia in perhaps practice development, perhaps in research.
Yeah.
Shall I hand over to you, Julian, first?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the key institutions in the UK as well, there are many that would look at involving people who have lived experience of either learning disability and dementia or one or the other. So Professor Stuart Todd, who's at University of South Wales, he would be one of the leading, I think he's just about to retire or step back, but obviously all the work that he has done, there's a great body of involving people with a learning disability in his research. And then the university, so Professor Tony Holland, who was at the University of Cambridge, set up the dementia research programme there with a particular interest in Down syndrome. And they've worked with the Down Syndrome Association because it's quite difficult. I mean, obviously, to get ethical approval, you have to demonstrate that people can give informed consent, that you're not going to cause any additional harm or distress to individuals. One of the key issues for us, for example, would be perhaps involving younger people with Down syndrome, because obviously once somebody is in the throes of developing dementia, it's quite difficult to meaningfully involve them then in sharing their views. Not impossible, but more difficult. If you're talking to a younger age group, you're then introducing to them, which they may well be aware of, that they are at a higher risk of developing dementia, but they may not, or you may be introducing that topic and then that might actually cause distress to people if you're not following that up and providing that information in a sort of non-threatening and supportive way and giving people an opportunity to discuss any of their concerns. So we worked with the other area would be King's College London and Professor Andre Stryden, so he's another key individual, and so we have worked with those researchers in developing meaningful, easy read information so that people can give informed consent. And, some of the studies, particularly the more invasive studies, you're asking a huge commitment from people. Some people, for example, are having to have regular blood tests because they're looking at the action of a medication on their cognitive ability. They're having to go back and, they're committing to an ongoing study for many years. So they're being very altruistic in doing that. But there is a willingness, I think, people in all walks of life, but including people with Down syndrome, are very happy to give of their time and their views if they understand that it might not actually benefit them. Because if you think about development of new medications, that's something that could be 15, 20 years further down the line, but they want to be able to do something that will be a benefit to everybody. So yeah, certainly it is possible, but it is more difficult because you're having to make sure that people are giving informed consent and understand the sort of parameters of the study.
Thanks, Julian. And Sophia, I don't know if you have something to add to that, perhaps building on some of the research around technologies, for example.
Yeah, I think the Down Syndrome Association has a structured process for researchers to be contacting people. I have to admit, it was the first time we produced an easy read of our participant information sheet and consent form. But now that we know how to do it, we will be doing it more regularly as well. And and the participants were very happy to share their views and talk about the technologies more recently, because the technology, and particularly technology assisted care, is quite a new thing. So technology is evolving all the time. So I think it was quite an interesting experience, also talking about something like we didn't know some of these technologies because they're quite specialized, and also people tend to use what they have a personal preference for.
Yeah, and that sense of preferences and individuality comes across, doesn't it, in both of the areas that you're looking at. And I can see the comment in the chat about really liking the film, which is really great. And those sorts of things are incredibly powerful, aren't they, when we share stories. And I know the video that you shared, Julian, earlier as well, from John's sisters, and the photograph of, I think it was Francis's 75th birthday. Those individual stories are really powerful when we think about what that can share about people's experiences. And I guess one of the things that I reflect on is, we've mentioned already, I think, Sophia, you mentioned about cultural and language diversity, and that brings in, again, additional consideration. So I wonder if either of you, or perhaps both of you, have anything to reflect on around ensuring that a diverse range of people are involved, again, in practice development, perhaps research, perhaps the videos and as the resources that you have shared a little bit about, and whether things around an additional language considerations bring, again, those opportunities, but again, perhaps some of the kind of challenges, perhaps kind of the issues. Anything you'd like to share about that?
From our perspective, so we're a membership organisation, but we are very active in, you don't have to be a member in order to access any of our support or contribute to our work. But if people will find their way to our information, they generally are members because they get sent regular emails, they get journals, they get mailings from us. Like most charities, we have a programme of trying to be as diverse as possible. With the criticism that we're probably white, middle class, middle England or middle Wales is probably fair, that, there is a particular type of population that will naturally join an organisation. So it's probably practitioners on the ground that would have contact with, universal services, GPs, social services, that would be seeing everybody. They would be a conduit into recruiting people. On the language issue, it's quite interesting, having done a lot of work in Wales, where I remember going to deliver some dementia training up in North Wales, where the particular issue that they had encountered were people with Down syndrome who were bilingual, had developed dementia in later life, but their first language was Welsh. So they had then lost the ability to communicate in English. And then that posed challenge, perhaps within a supported living setting, that they didn't have the population of support staff who were Welsh speaking. So it was, posing a communication issue. And I know I've done some work with BAME communities in Wales, and they would say similar for, people who have settled in Wales, but maybe have learned English as a second language. As they lose skills, their ability to communicate in their second language then gets affected, and they revert to being more confident in using the language that they had learned first, and that then it isn't always noted in a way that perhaps it should be.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. And just a reminder, please do put any questions that you might have for our panel in the chat, or indeed if you'd like to hear anything more about some of the information and resources you've already heard about. So I guess the same question for you, Sophia. When we think about, again, things around language, ethnicity as a form of diversity, what were the considerations, particularly for that WIN network work that you proposed? Were there perhaps challenges? Did you manage to include, I guess, a diverse range of people in that project?
Yeah, and what I was going to mention was from the last workshop that we did with the Wales Council for Deaf People, was that for people who are using sign language, if they acquire vision loss later in life, then their ability to see people using their hands diminishes. So this poses challenges for tactile communication. So they were sharing with us some new techniques for using sign language through touching. And I would say that the engagement of diverse communities involves a lot of face-to-face work, meeting people where they are. We've been we visited Aberystwyth. We held workshops online and face-to-face in different places. What we find that's really useful is to find where and when do people like to meet and kind of go there, or take people out for dinner in their favorite place. Sometimes people prefer to meet in the early evening, when all the jobs have finished. And if the project taps into how people, like to socialize and give their views, then that usually works really well. We also try and mix and match the way we collect data. So we might, depending on the audience, we might use creative methods so that people might create a collage, for example. So we use printouts of technologies, and we ask people to cut out what they find useful, or what they have an opinion on, and communicate that to us visually. And what we find is that when our participants are put in the driving seat of giving feedback, then it creates a completely different response to just us, doing a question and then they provide an answer.
If I could just interject very quickly, we've had a couple of comments from Jane Mullins in the comments, and also Jane's raised their hand. So if you're happy, I can unmute you, Jane, and if you want to share your comments.
Hello, hi Sophia, hi Vicky, Victoria. It's nice to meet you, Julian. It was I'm interested. Julian, I'd like to meet with you at some point if you don't mind. I know Victoria and Sophia because I've helped out with research before, and I now deliver dementia training. And I've been actually asked from Greater Manchester staff to deliver training with dementia and learning disability. So, and I have to say I'm a nurse who's worked with people with dementia, but not with people with learning disability, so I feel a bit of a fraud otherwise. So I'd love to meet with you, and but I'm just interested also what Sophia was saying as well around, I use sensory ethnography for my PhD to explore ways of communicating with people who are struggling to communicate, to find out things that matter most. And I just wanted to sort of reiterate what you were saying there, those lovely creative techniques. We can get such better results, really. And another thing, really, just an observation, is what you were just saying now about, listening to the families as well. And I jotted down quite a few things. I used to work in the memory clinic in Bath and Cardiff, and it is this is the thing that learning disability nurses are asking me, is the subtle changes at the beginning. This is what they're saying is what they want to find out more about, really, is how do they identify that. And it's really difficult because I've just written everything that you've got there could be for someone who has dementia, but not with a learning disability. The one thing I've come across quite a lot, though, is apathy. And a lot of people talk about behavioural changes, but people don't seem to think about apathy a lot, that get up and go. And I think that's what they were saying about the chap, wasn't it? The brother, really. He was, so it's really subtle, isn't it? Yeah. Those early stages, really. So, but can I just thank you for an awesome, session. Is it okay if you can I email you both? Is that all right? If I can find your email, that'd be lovely. But thank you.
If I could just come back to, I've made some very interesting points there. I think one of the things, I mean, two particular things in relation to sort of the apathy, absolutely would concur that it's often a behavioural change that is more prevalent in people with a learning disability. You often see in the general population, people focus on memory, I'm getting forgetful, and that can be obviously an indicator for people with a learning disability, but it's usually a behavioural issue that people will first note. We saw, I mean, the pandemic had a huge impact on individuals, partly because the proactive work wasn't happening. So the assessments, people going into people's homes had to be paused. So there was probably a backlog of people who were developing dementia who hadn't had the sort of recent assessments. Annual health checks got paused for a period, and there was a catch up. But we also saw significant response to lockdown amongst us all, but particularly people with a learning disability who saw their lives upended. Everything stopped. They couldn't go to their regular day service, their volunteering, if they had part-time jobs, all of that generally stopped. And so some people, I think, were probably inappropriately being considered to be developing dementia when it was an understandable thankfully, although when we think about recovery from that, for many people, it's only now that people are beginning to come out of that. And there's also another phenomena that we are beginning to understand a lot more about, and there's more information about that on our website, about regression in early adulthood. It's a very notable thing. We're not entirely sure what's causing that, but it isn't dementia, and it thankfully isn't permanent. It can, for some, I mean, I can think of individuals who definitely experience cognitive loss, withdrawal, everything that mimic dementia. They might have only been in their 20s, and it would be very unusual for somebody of that age to be developing dementia, and then with a series of different types of intervention have recovered function. So it obviously wasn't dementia, and there's a big area of interest in that globally, because it's not just in the UK we're experiencing that, it's across international populations.
It's interesting, isn't it? That social isolation has been devastating for so many people, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, thanks, Julian.
Thanks very much, Jane. And I know you've put some other items in there.
Sorry, I went on a bit. Apologies.
You're very welcome. That's what we like, this discussion. So very, very welcome. Very welcome. And I don't know, Sophia, if there's anything you want to add to that as well. I guess that apathy question and that subtlety question, I guess those, again, similarly might impact some of that work that you've been talking about. When we think about use of technology, perhaps we think about involvement in the WIN network and other types of activities where how you can kind of reach people that perhaps might be less inclined to take part. How you reach those people, I guess, that question.
What we find is that usually when we put a call out, the first people who respond are people who are very comfortable collaborating with the university, and they're quite engaged, and they like to help. We did try and work through different routes, and having a little bit longer, I would say, really assisted us with that. I think another issue is that I mentioned the ongoing development work that we're doing, because I think for those less glamorous parts of, dementia and aging, people need to know you to start talking to you about part of life that, some people might find embarrassing, or that are so ordinary that one might not think about talking about. So we are very pleased that we have the investment from Healthcare Research Wales, and from other partners from the Centre for Trials Research, so that we can build our research capacity in the long term in this field, and I think we are very aware that, we are at the beginning of our inquiry, and it is an inquiry that's inclusive of all the underrepresented groups, and this is by intention and by design, because we're interested in intersectionality and similarities and differences in how different groups use technologies to support dementia care. And we also know that technology changes all the time, and there are a lot of barriers there. So we're definitely aware that there are elements of the service user experience that we haven't talked about, and we will just need a little bit longer to, recontact people, use snowball sampling to find out some new people with lived experiences.
Yeah, great. So lots of potential opportunities for the future, and I guess collaboration is key to all of that, as we've heard today. So we're approaching the end of our time, unfortunately, but it's been really fascinating, and I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking both Julian and Sofia for sharing your work and engaging in those discussions. And of course, a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I can see lots of comments in the chat about today's session being really very valuable, and the conference series as a whole. And you've had some information about how you can access other items in the conference series, and as I say, you will have a link to the recording from today as well, and I'm sure today's speakers are always happy to be contacted individually. So on behalf of myself and ExChange, thank you very much, Julian and Sofia, and thank you for everyone who has joined us today, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you all.